This is not a story about heroes. It is not a story about victory. This is the story of how the world learned that the end was never meant to be stopped. Welcome. Get comfortable. Settle in wherever you're listening from. The wars are far away tonight. The gods are quiet, and nothing is asking anything of you. You don't need to follow every name. You don't need to stay awake until the end. Just listen or rest. Tonight's story is The End Times, Nagash, and the first story to a 5-book series. The God Who Refused to Stay Dead. Chapter 1. Before the end times began, the world believed it understood death. It was feared, ritualized, prayed over, and occasionally abused, but it was contained. A boundary, a passage, a law older than empires. Death had rules, and for a very long time, those rules held. Nagash was the first to realize they could be rewritten. Not broken, rewritten. Long before the end times, before chaos spilled across the world in apocalyptic tides, before gods walked openly among mortals, Nagash was already dead. And that should have been the end of him. In life, Nagash was a tyrant, a scholar, and a visionary in equal measure. Born into the priesthood of Nehekara, he did not worship death. He studied it. He catalogued funerary rites, dissected burial customs, and memorized the prayers meant to guide souls beyond the mortal world. But where others saw reverence, Nagash saw inefficiency. Death, as practiced, was wasteful. Souls dispersed, power leaked, memory faded. For Nagash, this was intolerable. He did not seek immortality out of fear. He sought control. If death was inevitable, then it should at least be useful. That belief would doom the world. Nagash's early experiments were subtle. Refined poisons, alchemical elixirs, funerary enhancements meant to preserve flesh and spirit beyond decay. Each success emboldened him. Each failure taught him more. Eventually, subtlety gave way to ambition. He wrote the first of the 9 books of Nagash, grimoires that did not merely describe necromancy, but defined it. They were not spell books, they were manuals. When Nagash seized power, Nehekara bled. Cities fell not to armies, but to plagues designed with surgical cruelty. Rivers turned black with poison. Entire populations were harvested in service of rituals meant to reshape death itself. Nagash did not rule through loyalty. He ruled through inevitability. The Black Pyramid rose from the desert like a wound in the world, a monument not to faith, but to function. From its summit, Nagash attempted the unthinkable, a ritual that would bind every soul in Nehekara to his will. He failed, but the failure mattered less than the attempt. Nagash was destroyed, poisoned, betrayed, torn apart, and scattered. His body was burned, his name cursed, his memory buried beneath centuries of deliberate forgetting. The world moved on. Death, it believed, had won. But Nagash did not die the way others did. He had planned for this. Fragments of his essence lingered, bound into artifacts, soaked into soil, embedded in the 9 books themselves. Over centuries, cultists whispered his name. Necromancers rediscovered his writings. Each reading, each experiment, each minor success fed something dormant, not a soul, a process. Nagash did not return all at once. He assembled himself, piece by piece, ritual by ritual, corpse by corpse. While empires rose and fell, Nagash rebuilt quietly, patiently, learning from his own destruction. He learned humility. He learned scale. He learned that gods were not obstacles, merely competitors. When the end times approached, most threats announced themselves loudly. Chaos howled. Prophecies screamed. The heavens burned with omens. Nagash did none of this. He waited. When he finally returned, it was not as a king, not as a lich, not even as a god. He returned as an infrastructure problem. Death itself began to behave differently. Necromantic rituals grew easier. The dead answered calls they should not have heard. Entire graveyards stirred without command or provocation. At first, no one connected the signs. By the time they did, Nagash was already everywhere. The End Times did not begin with invasion. They began with ownership. Ownership of death. Ownership of the soul. Ownership of what happens after the final breath. This was not conquest. It was a hostile takeover of the universe's oldest system, and it had already been approved centuries ago by the one man arrogant enough to believe death needed improvement. Nagash did not return to end the world. He returned to make sure it finally belonged to him. The Crown of Bone, Chapter 2. Nagash did not rise into a vacuum. He rose into a world that had already begun to crack. The End Times were stirring. Chaos cults multiplied. Prophecies resurfaced. Old alliances frayed under the strain of fear and uncertainty. The living felt it in their bones. Something vast was approaching. Most believed it would come screaming. They were watching the horizon. Nagash was beneath their feet. His first true act upon returning was not war. It was consolidation. He reached outward, not with armies, but with authority. Necromancers across the world felt it. A sudden clarity in their heart, a disturbing sense that their spells were no longer improvisation, but execution. The dead responded faster. Rituals required fewer components. Failures became rare. Power had found a central source. Those who recognized the change were the first to die. Necromancers who realized their spells were being answered rather than cast. Lisha priests who understood that their gods were no longer the final arbiters of undeath. Some tried to resist. Some tried to bargain. All of them were absorbed. Nagash did not tolerate decentralization. The crown of sorcery was forged anew, bone layered upon bone, spell layered upon spell, not as ornament, but as interface. Through it, Nagash expanded his reach, anchoring himself more firmly in the material world. He was no longer a shadow, no longer a rumor. He was a presence. The dead began to change, not visibly, not yet, but behaviorally. They no longer lingered, no longer haunted without purpose. Spirits ceased their wandering and instead waited for instruction. The afterlife had developed a cue. Nagash turned his attention to the past, not out of nostalgia, but because the past was full of unfinished business. Artifacts long thought inert awakened. The 9 books resurfaced in multiple places at once, their words subtly altered, updated, refined. Ancient burial sites stirred, their wards dissolving not through brute force, but irrelevance. Nagash did not break protections. He rendered them obsolete. This was when the world finally noticed. Reports reached scholars and kings alike. Graveyards behaving oddly. Ancestral spirits refusing summons. Undead hosts moving without necromancers at their head. Something was coordinating the dead. Something old. Something patient. Attempts were made to name the threat. Most failed. Nagash's true horror was not spectacle. It was plausibility. The idea that death could be managed appealed to minds already strained by apocalypse. The idea that the chaos of dying could be reduced to order, to certainty, to function. For some, this was not terrifying. It was comforting. Cults spread quietly. They did not promise immortality. They promised structure. Serve Nagash, and your death would have purpose. Your soul would not be lost, stolen, or tormented by the whims of gods or demons. It would be accounted for. Nagash allowed these cults to grow. He did not guide them, he observed them. Those that misunderstood his intent were eliminated, those that aligned were repurposed. He was not building a religion, he was testing compliance. And then, at last, he turned his gaze south, to Nehekara, the land of his birth, the land that had killed him, the land that believed it had escaped him. The Tomb Kings had built an empire around one principle: never again. Never again would Nagash rule. Never again would death be monopolized. Never again would a single will command eternity. Their entire civilization was a counterspell. Nagash smiled, not in anger, not in nostalgia, in recognition. Nehekara had preserved itself perfectly, unchanged, static, predictable, exactly as he had always intended. As the Nagash's power touched the deserts, ancient wards flickered. Spells renewed for millennia began to misfire. Leecher priests felt a pressure they had not known since the age of myth. Not intrusion, but precedence. Their magic still worked. It simply no longer belonged to them. Nagash did not invade Nehekara. He returned, and Nehekara remembered him. The world thought Nagash was preparing for war. In truth, he was correcting history. If you'd like more long, quiet Warhammer lore like this, consider subscribing. It really does help, more than you might think. And if you're already part of the channel, thank you for being here. Nehekara Falls. Chapter 3. Nehekara had already died once. Its rivers had dried. Its cities had become mausoleums. Its people had traded breath for eternity rather than allow time to erase them. And in their own way, the Tomb Kings believed they had won. They remembered Nagash. They remembered his tyranny, his experiments, his poisons and lies. They remembered the wars fought to destroy him, the alliances forged in shared hatred, the rituals that shattered his body and scattered his essence to the winds. History, they believed, had closed its ledger. Nagash had been defeated. They were wrong. Nehekara had not escaped Nagash. It had been preserved. For millennia, the Tomb Kings ruled an empire locked in ritual and repetition. Their world did not change. It did not grow. It endured. Every incantation, every burial rite, every funerary ward existed for one purpose: to keep Nagash out. That defense required perfection. Nagash required only patience. When he returned, Nehekara felt it immediately, not as invasion, not as war, as recognition. Ancient sigils dimmed. Wards etched into stone before the rise of the empire flickered and failed. Spells renewed generation after generation began to unravel, their logic dissolving like sand through skeletal fingers. The Tomb Kings felt something they had not known since the age of myth. Not fear, authority. Nagash did not announce himself. He did not need to. They had always known his voice. Setra the Imperishable was among the first to understand the truth. He had ruled as king, god, and tyrant in equal measure. He had defied Nagash in life and in death. His will had bent empires and shattered armies. Even as a corpse king, Setra believed himself unconquered. When Nagash's power pressed down upon Nehekara, Setra did not bow. He resisted. And for a moment, a brief, impossible moment, it almost mattered. Nagash did not answer defiance with rage. He answered it with revision. The spells that bound Nehekara's kings were not broken. They were rewritten. Funerary rites once designed to preserve independence inverted themselves, their meanings folded inward. Constructs that had guarded tombs for centuries froze mid-motion as their animating magic was stripped away and redirected elsewhere. The Tomb King's greatest strength, their perfect, unchanging order, became their greatest weakness. They could not adapt. Nagash did not conquer Nehekara. He updated it. Across the deserts, skeletal legions collapsed where they stood, not destroyed, but disconnected. Hierarchies failed. Commands vanished mid-thought. Kings attempted to rally their hosts, only to discover their words no longer carried authority. The dead still listened, just not to them. Nagash's will pressed down like a law of nature, not commanding, not requesting, assuming compliance. Setra confronted Nagash, not as a supplicant, not as a servant, as a king. Their meeting was not a duel worthy of legend. There was no clash of equals, no heroic last stand. There was only reality asserting itself. Setra refused to kneel. Nagash did not force him to. He simply removed the possibility of refusal. Setra's will, immense, ancient, iron-bound, was analyzed, constrained, and reduced. His defiance became data. His hatred became fuel. His eternity became a resource to be managed. Nagash did not destroy the Tomb Kings. He made them useful. This was the true horror of Nehekara's fall. Not annihilation, not corruption, appropriation. The Tomb Kings had built their civilization to deny Nagash mastery over death. In doing so, they had preserved themselves in a state perfectly suited for reclamation. Their armies became his. Their knowledge became his. Their millennia of preparation became his foundation. The kings were not enslaved. They were incorporated. News of Nehekara's subjugation spread slowly. At first, it was dismissed as exaggeration. Tomb Kings had always been dangerous. Nagash had always been a shadow over the deserts. Surely nothing truly new had occurred. But necromancers noticed the change. The dead of Nehekara no longer answered any call but one. Ancient incantations failed outright. Relics that had resisted Nagash's influence for centuries now resonated with it instinctively. The past itself had changed ownership. Among the living, scholars finally grasped the scale of what had occurred. Nagash had not merely returned. He had resolved a contradiction that had existed since the age of myth. Death could not serve multiple masters, and now it did not. Faith began to fracture. Priests struggled to explain why ancestral spirits no longer responded. Entire belief systems collapsed overnight as proof mounted that afterlives had been compromised, overwritten, or erased. Mortals began asking a question no god could answer comfortably. If Nagash owns death, what do the gods still rule? Nehekara became a symbol, not of resistance, not of tragedy, of inevitability. If even the Tomb Kings, ancient, prepared, defiant beyond reason, could be reduced to components in Nagash's design, then what hope did the living truly have? Kingdoms began to understand the truth. Not all threats arrive with fire and steel. Some arrive with paperwork. Nagash did not march north. He did not strike at the empire. He did not confront chaos. He did something far more devastating. He waited. Every death now strengthened him. Every burial fed him. Every war narrowed the world's remaining options. Nehekara's fall was not the loudest moment of the end times, but it was the moment resistance acquired an expiration date. The Tomb Kings believed eternity would protect them. They did not understand that Nagash had invented eternity. When Faith Breaks. Chapter 4. The world did not learn of Nehekara's fall through fire or proclamation. It learned through silence. Prayers went unanswered. Rites failed. The dead no longer behaved as they were meant to. At first, these were isolated incidents, easy to dismiss, easier to explain away. A miscast spell, a flawed ritual, a god testing the resolve of the faithful. But the pattern spread, and patterns, unlike miracles, are difficult to ignore. In temples across the old world, priests found themselves speaking into a void. The familiar warmth of divine attention, that subtle sense of being heard, was gone, not absent, but occupied, as if the channel itself had been claimed by something else. Funerary rites became unreliable. Souls lingered when they should have departed. Spirits were dragged screaming into necromantic service without warning, without summoning circles, without consent. The afterlife had stopped being a destination. It had become infrastructure. The cult of Mor realized the truth first. For centuries, Mor had ruled the boundary between life and death. Guardian of graves, shepherd of souls, warden against necromancy. His priests were trained to feel disturbances, to sense when the dead were restless. Now, the dead were not restless. They were busy. Graveyards across the empire grew unnaturally quiet. No hauntings, no omens, just a heavy stillness, like a door sealed from the other side. The clergy of Mor understood what that meant. The god of death was no longer the highest authority in his own domain. Wizards fared no better. Amethyst mages of the colleges of magic reported catastrophic inconsistencies. Spells that had worked for decades now produced warped results. Corpses reanimating without command, spirits manifesting in the wrong bodies, rituals collapsing into raw death energy that flowed away like water down a drain. To where, no one knew. Necromancy, once a delicate and dangerous art, had become efficient, easier, cleaner, deadlier, and every success left the caster with the same disturbing sensation. They were being watched. Rumors outpaced truth. Some claimed Nagash was devouring souls outright. Others insisted he was storing them, hoarding the dead for a final apocalyptic working. More disturbing still were whispers that he was reassigning them, erasing old afterlives and replacing them with something far worse. None of it could be proven. That made it unbearable. Kings demanded answers. Priests argued doctrine. Scholars opened books that had not been touched since the fall of Khemri. And again, the same name surfaced. Nagash, not as myth, not as warning, as precedent. The living had forgotten an uncomfortable truth. Nagash was not merely a necromancer. He was a system builder. The Black Pyramid, the 9 books, the great rituals of Nehekara. These were not acts of madness. They were architectural, attempts to impose order on death itself. The Tomb Kings had rejected him because he sought control, not reverence. Now that control had been achieved. Faith fractured along predictable lines. Some prayed harder, louder, longer, as if volume might overcome metaphysical annexation. Others abandoned the gods entirely, turning to nihilism, excess, or chaos. If death was already claimed, what was left to fear? And a smaller, far more dangerous group chose acceptance. They reasoned that if Nagash ruled death, then opposition was pointless. Better to serve willingly than be processed without consent. Cults formed quietly. They did not promise immortality. They promised relevance. The gods themselves felt the shift, not as pain, not as injury, as disconnection. Divine realms reliant on funerary belief and ancestral worship began to weaken. Mor's domain dimmed. Lesser death spirits vanished entirely, not slain, but overwritten. Nagash was not attacking the gods. He was rendering some of them obsolete. For the first time since the coming of chaos, the pantheons faced a threat that could not be met with armies. You cannot smite an accounting error. You cannot duel a rewritten law of nature. Nagash had not declared war on heaven. He had altered the terms of existence. Mortals felt it most sharply in moments of grief. Mothers who buried children felt no closure. Soldiers who survived battle sensed their fallen comrades had not gone where they should. Funerals became anxious affairs, heavy with uncertainty. Not where are they now, but who has them? And through it all, Nagash remained silent. No proclamations, no demands, no crusades, just a constant, inexorable increase in presence. Every corpse, every battlefield, every quiet death in the night, all of it flowed the same way. The world had lived with death forever. But now it understood something far worse. Death was no longer neutral. It had a master. When the living realized death had changed, it was already far too late. Because Nagash did not need belief, only bodies. The Undying Return, Chapter 5. The dead had a hierarchy. They always had. Even in undeath, there were kings and servants, masters and thralls. Tomb Kings ruled by ancient right. Vampires ruled through blood and fear. Lesser necromancers clung to scraps of borrowed authority. But above them all, there had once been a name that none dared speak aloud. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was unfinished. Nagash did not announce his return. He did not need to. The moment Archon the Black felt his master stir, the truth was already beyond denial. Archon had waited centuries for this moment. Not in hope. Archon was not capable of such weakness, but in certainty. His loyalty to Nagash had never wavered, even when his master lay shattered, scattered across relics and half-remembered rituals. While others ruled kingdoms, Archon guarded intent. And now, that intent had awakened. The winds of Shyish bent around him. Spells that once required careful preparation now flowed as if eager to be cast. The dead responded without resistance, falling into formation with the precision of soldiers who had been drilling for lifetimes. Archon did not smile. This was not triumph. This was alignment. Across the deserts of Nehechara, something else stirred. Setra the imperishable, great king of Kemri, had ruled long before Nagash's name was ever cursed. His was a dominion built on conquest, pride, and unyielding authority. Setra did not kneel. He did not bargain, and he did not forget. The winds carried ill news. The dead were moving without summons. Tomb legions shifted in their sepulchres, not in response to royal command, but to something older and deeper. Setra felt it as an insult before he recognized it as a threat. Someone was issuing orders in his lands. Where Arkan saw destiny fulfilled, Setra saw theft. Nagash had once been a priest, a servant, a usurper. And now that same traitor dared to reclaim dominion over death itself, over Setra's subjects. That could not stand. Not in life, not in death. The first open acts of defiance were small. A legion that failed to answer Setra's call, a tomb city whose guardians marched east instead of south. A leech priest who went silent mid-ritual, his soul torn away before Setra could interrogate it. Each incident alone was tolerable. Together, they formed a declaration. Nagash was no longer content to rule unseen. He was consolidating. Arkan moved swiftly. Relics long hidden were retrieved, obelisks reforged, ley lines of death energy mapped and anchored. Wherever resistance arose, it was not crushed through force, it was absorbed. Opposing undead were not destroyed. They were corrected, rewritten. This was not conquest as the living understood it. Nagash did not seize territory. He seized function. If something served death, it served him. If it did not, it would. The living finally took notice when armies began to vanish. Not slain, not defeated, simply removed. Battlefields emptied overnight, corpses marching away without banners or commanders, leaving behind weapons and blood-soaked soil. The dead were being recalled, not as reinforcements, as components. Setra marched to war, not because he feared Nagash, but because no other response was acceptable. His chariots thundered across the desert, legions rising at his command, banners snapping in defiance of the very idea that death could have a single master. This was not a clash of armies, it was a clash of philosophies. Setra believed death was a reward for greatness. Nagash believed death was a resource, and resources did not get to say no. The first true confrontation was catastrophic, not in scale, but in implication. When Setra's chosen warriors fell, they did not return to his service. They rose again under a different will. For the first time since his resurrection, Setra experienced something unfamiliar. Loss. The realization struck like a blade. Nagash was not merely stronger. He was fundamental. He did not challenge authority. He superseded it. Arkan watched the war unfold without intervention. Victory was not measured in battles won. It was measured in inevitability. Every fallen warrior fed the same system. Every act of resistance strengthened the very force it opposed. Nagash did not need to defeat Setra. Time would do that. And in the distance, far from desert and tomb, other powers began to pay attention. Chaos sensed competition. The gods felt pressure. Because death once the great equalizer, was no longer neutral ground. It was being claimed. Setra marched to war to defend his kingdom. Khan prepared the world for something far worse, because Nagash was not returning to rule the dead. He was returning to redefine what death meant. War without battlefields. Chapter 6. The war did not spread outward. It collapsed inward. There were no front lines, no declarations, no single moment when the world agreed that a new war had begun. Because this was not a war for territory, it was a war for definition. Nagash's influence moved like pressure through stone, unseen, unstoppable, and catastrophic only once it was far too late to react. Across the old world and beyond, the dead stopped behaving as they always had. Not violently, not rebelliously. They simply stopped responding. Vampire counts issued commands that went unanswered. Necromancers found their thralls standing idle, awaiting orders from elsewhere. Entire undead hosts froze mid-march, weapons raised, eyes empty. Then, as one, they turned. Not toward enemies, toward Nagash. This was the moment the vampires understood their mistake. They had believed themselves masters of death, immortal lords standing outside the natural order, feeding on it rather than serving it. But Nagash had never seen them as rivals, only borrowers. And the dead was being called in. Some vampires resisted. They unleashed ancient blood magic, tore apart their own armies, attempted to sever the necromantic bonds that linked them to Nagash's growing dominion. It did not save them. The dead they destroyed simply rose again, quieter, cleaner, obedient to a higher authority. Those who survived felt something worse than defeat. They felt irrelevance. The living fared no better. Where once armies clashed and cities burned, now entire regions fell silent. Not conquered, not razed, just emptied. The dead walked away from their graves, leaving the living behind to realize that even their ancestors had abandoned them. The colleges of magic convened in panic. The amethyst wind was no longer behaving like a force of nature. It flowed with intent, curved around obstacles, answered to patterns no living wizard had designed. Shyish had developed a will, and that will had a name. For the gods, denial ended swiftly. Mor's realm dimmed further, its borders collapsing inward as souls bypassed his halls entirely. Lesser death gods vanished, their domains folding into nothingness without struggle or sound. Nagash was not killing them. He was absorbing their purpose. The Pantheon responded too late. Divine emissaries were dispatched, omens sent, champions chosen. None returned. Not slain, simply reclaimed. This was not blasphemy. Blasphemy implies rebellion. Nagash was not rebelling against the gods. He was replacing a function they had grown complacent in performing. Chaos noticed next. At first, the dark gods welcomed the disruption. Mortal despair fed them well, and the collapse of order was always fertile ground. But then the souls stopped arriving. Not fewer, none. Those claimed by Nagash did not pass through the realm of chaos. They did not dissolve into madness or power, the great game. They were processed, stored, denied, This was unacceptable. For the first time since the dawn of chaos, the gods of ruin faced a limit. They could corrupt the living, but Nagash owned the dead. The response was immediate and catastrophic. Demonic incursions surged, tearing at the fabric of reality in an attempt to seize souls before Nagash could claim them. Entire cities were overrun not for conquest, but for harvest. Even chaos was racing the clock. And Nagash watched, not in anger, not in fear, with calculation. Every soul chaos ripped screaming from the world was one that proved his necessity. Every demonic excess accelerated mortal extinction. And extinction fed only one master. Death did not care who won the war, only that everyone eventually lost. Cetra's war reached its breaking point. His legions still fought, still obeyed, still conquered. But every victory shrank his authority. Each fallen enemy rose aligned elsewhere. Each dead ally became a liability. Cetra could command the dead. Nagash commanded death itself. And the difference was everything. Archon finally acted, not with armies, with finality. The last anchors of Nagash's power were activated. The Black Pyramid's influence spread beyond Nehekara, its shadow stretching across continents, pulling ley lines of death into perfect alignment. The system was complete. This was no longer a return. It was an installation. Death, as a force of the cosmos, had been updated. The living began to understand the truth in fragments. There would be no victory, no restoration, no return to how things had been. Even if Nagash were destroyed, even if his form were shattered, the structure he had built would remain. Death no longer belonged to the universe belonged to death. Chaos sought dominion. The gods sought worship. Mortals sought survival. Nagash sought something far simpler, that when everything ended, it would end correctly. The God that would not die. Chapter 7. There comes a moment in every apocalypse when resistance stops being brave and starts being symbolic. Part 7 begins at that moment. Nagash did not crown himself a god. He did not need to. Godhood is not granted by ceremony, nor by proclamation. It is achieved when reality begins to behave as if your will is law, and reality was already obeying. Across the world, the nature of death finished changing. Souls no longer drifted. They no longer lingered. They no longer chose. The instant life ended. The transition was absolute, a clean severance followed by immediate integration into Nagash's domain. No judgment, no afterlife, no escape. Death had become administrative. For the first time, the gods truly understood what they were facing. Nagash was not a rival deity, scrabbling for worship or power. He did not need prayers. He did not need belief. He did not even need victory. He needed only time, because every second that passed delivered him more souls than any god had ever possessed. More made his stand, not with armies, with law. The god of death attempted to reassert his ancient dominion, calling upon covenants older than civilization itself, the oldest agreements between gods and mortals, the promise that death would be guided, not owned. Nagash answered by ignoring them. The covenants unraveled. not shattered, rendered irrelevant. When Mor's realm finally collapsed, it did not explode. It dimmed, a divine domain guttering like a dying candle, its light siphoned away into something colder, larger, and infinitely more patient. Mor did not scream. Gods rarely do. But he was no longer whole. Other gods reacted with fear disguised as fury. Champions were empowered beyond mortal limits. Artifacts were unleashed that had not tasted battle since the dawn of the world. Entire nations were offered up in sacrifice to fuel last, desperate miracles. It did not change the outcome. Divine champions still died. And now their deaths served Nagash. This was the cruel symmetry of it. Every attempt to destroy him fed him. Every war, every sacrifice, every glorious last stand only increased the flow of souls into his grasp. For the first time in history, heroism had a cost the gods could not afford. Settra refused to yield. Even as his authority eroded, even as his legions fell away, he marched, not because victory was possible, but because submission was unthinkable. To kneel to Nagash would mean admitting that Settra was merely another corpse in a universe of corpses, and Settra was no one's subject. Their confrontation was not thunderous. No sky split, no continents burned. It was quiet. Two ancient wills colliding, each convinced the universe had no right to contradict them. Settra struck Nagash down, and Nagash rose, again and again and again. This was the truth Settra could not overcome. You cannot defeat death by killing it. Nagash did not fear annihilation, because annihilation was just another transition. Arkan bore witness, not as a servant awaiting orders, but as a priest watching prophecy fulfill itself. He understood now what Nagash was becoming. Not a god of death, but death made divine. A god whose worship was mandatory, whose dominion was automatic, whose power scaled endlessly with extinction. The perfect god for the end times. Chaos made its move. The dark gods could tolerate many things, defiance, corruption, even defeat. But they could not tolerate irrelevance. If Nagash claimed all souls, then chaos would starve, and starving gods become desperate. Reality cracked. Demons flooded the world not to conquer it, but to destroy it faster than Nagash could harvest it. The aim was no longer victory, it was denial. If chaos could not have the souls, neither could Nagash. And still he endured. Cities burned, worlds bled, the sky itself tore open. And through it all, death continued, steady, obedient, inexhaustible. Every apocalypse chaos unleashed only accelerated the process. This was the final irony. The gods of destruction were hastening the triumph of the god who thrived on endings. Nagash did not need to stop chaos. Chaos was working for him. By the end of Part 7, the world was no longer collapsing. It was settling, like dust after an explosion. The shape of the future was visible now, if only in outline. A universe where death was unified, where gods were optional, where resistance was temporary. Nagash did not conquer the world. He outlasted it. And in the end times, that was the only victory that mattered. The Price of Survival, Chapter 8. By the time the gods agreed to act together, it was already too late. Not too late to fight, too late to win cleanly. Nagash stood at the center of a system that no longer required him. That was the true horror. Even if his physical form was shattered, even if his consciousness were dispersed across the void, the machinery of death would continue to function. Souls would still flow. Death would still obey. Nagash had solved a problem the gods had never dared to address, and now they had to break the solution. For the first time since the coming of chaos, the gods convened not as rivals, but as survivors. Old grudges were set aside, ancient wars rendered irrelevant. What remained was a single, shared truth. If Nagash remained whole, everything else would end. Not immediately, but inevitably. Their plan was not elegant. It was not just. It was not even guaranteed to work. It was destructive enough to matter. They would not fight Nagash directly. They would poison his foundation. Nagash's power flowed from unity. One death, one destination, one will. So the gods chose to shatter that unity, not by stealing death back, but by overloading it. They would flood the world with so much destruction, so much metaphysical instability, that even Nagash's system would strain to contain it. A final surge, a controlled catastrophe. This was the moment morality died. To fuel their counterstroke, the gods demanded sacrifices on a scale unseen since the world's creation. Not offerings, not prayers. Entire populations, cities given over to annihilation so their souls could be weaponized in a single, desperate act of defiance. The gods did not deny what they were doing. They simply decided it was necessary. Nagash watched without interference. He understood. More than that, he approved. Every soul offered to stop him still passed through his grasp. Even resistance obeyed his rules. The ritual began. Across the world, reality convulsed. Ley lines fractured. Magical winds screamed. Time itself stuttered as power far beyond mortal tolerance was unleashed all at once. This was not an attack aimed at Nagash's body. It was aimed at his coherence. For the first time since his ascension, Nagash reacted, not with fury, with focus. The strain was immense. Souls surged faster than they could be processed. Death energy spiked wildly, tearing at the boundaries Nagash had so carefully imposed. For a fleeting moment, a single, impossible moment, death became chaotic again. That moment was the gods' opening. They struck, not with blades or spells, with contradiction. They forced incompatible truths into existence at once, afterlives layered atop one another, souls claimed by multiple powers simultaneously, death behaving as it once had and as Nagash demanded at the same time. The universe screamed. Nagash fractured, not destroyed, divided. His essence scattered across the Black Pyramid, the winds of Shyish, the artifacts that had once anchored him, and the innumerable dead already bound to his will. The god of death became diffuse. The gods had done it, at unimaginable cost, but the victory tasted of ash. Because Nagash had not been erased. He had been distributed, Every fragment still knew its purpose. Every shard still obeyed the same principle. Death remained unified, just no longer centralized. Worse still, the damage was irreversible. The old order of death did not return. More did not reclaim his realm. The dead did not find peace. All the gods had accomplished was preventing Nagash from becoming singular. They had not saved the world. They had changed how it ended. Chaos recoiled. This was not the victory they had sought. The destruction they had unleashed no longer fed them as it once had. Souls slipped through their grasp, unstable, half-claimed, tainted by too many masters to nourish anything cleanly. The great game faltered. For the first time, chaos felt uncertainty. And through the wreckage, Nagash endured, silent, patient, present everywhere death occurred, which was to say, everywhere. He was weaker, but he was inescapable. Mortals felt the consequences immediately. Resurrection became unpredictable. Undeath warped further. Ghosts screamed with too many memories. Corpses rose incomplete, carrying fragments of multiple afterlives within them. Death was no longer orderly, but it was still owned. The gods had bought time, nothing more, and time, in the end times, was a dwindling resource. The gods had shattered Nagash to save the world. Instead, they taught death how to exist without him, and that lesson would outlive them all. A world that refuses to die. Chapter 9. The world did not end when Nagash was shattered. That was the cruelest truth of all. The gods had acted. Chaos had raged. Death itself had been broken and reforged into something unstable. And still, the sun rose. Cities stood. Armies marched. People woke, breathed, and tried to pretend that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. It did not. Death no longer arrived cleanly. Some souls vanished instantly, claimed and consumed before last breaths faded. Others lingered, trapped, echoing, unsure whether they were alive or dead. Still others returned wrong, stitched together from fragments that had never been meant to coexist. The cycle was no longer a cycle. It was a wound. Necromancy spiraled out of control. Spells reanimated things that should not have risen. Corpses moved without orders, without purpose, driven by half-formed instincts pulled from incompatible afterlives. Graveyards became hazards. Battlefields became permanent. The dead no longer needed wars to increase. They generated themselves. The living learned quickly that survival was no longer the same as safety. Killing an enemy did not remove them. Sometimes it strengthened them. Faith collapsed next, not because people stopped believing, but because belief no longer mattered. Prayers were answered inconsistently, if at all. God spoke through omens that contradicted one another. Miracles worked one day and failed the next. Mortals realized something horrifying. The gods were guessing. With Nagash dispersed, no single will governed death, but neither did the old order return. Instead, fragments of his authority lingered everywhere, enforcing rules without context, judgment without mercy. Death had become procedural. It happened because it was meant to happen, not because anyone willed it so. Cetra still marched. He could not stop. To stop would be to admit that the universe no longer recognized kings. His legions fought not to conquer, but to assert relevance. Each city taken, each foe crushed, was proof, however fleeting, that authority still meant something. But even Cetra could not command what rose behind him. Victories turned hollow. Every battlefield birthed new horrors that answered to no banner at all. Chaos recoiled, then adapted. The dark gods had lost certainty, but not ambition. If souls could no longer be reliably claimed through death, then death itself would be bypassed. Corruption intensified. Possession became immediate. Chaos no longer waited for the end. It consumed the living outright. This only hastened the inevitable. Every act of excess shortened mortal lifespans. Every corrupted soul still passed, eventually, through death. And death, broken though it was, still leaned toward Nagash's design. Archon the Black remained, not commanding, not preaching, observing. He understood now that his master's greatest triumph was not godhood, it was inevitability. Even shattered, even diminished, Nagash had ensured that no force could fully escape death's authority again. The system no longer needed maintenance, it merely needed existence. The world itself began to fail, not catastrophically, subtly. Harvests spoiled faster, wounds healed incorrectly, births were plagued by stillness and silence. The boundary between beginning and ending thinned until neither could be trusted. Life felt temporary in a way it never had before. Not fragile, conditional. People stopped asking if the world would end. They began asking how long it would pretend not to. Wars continued because they had to. Hope persisted because it always does. But the shape of the future had narrowed. Every path led to the same horizon, one where death was no longer a passage, but a state the universe was slowly entering. The end times were no longer approaching. They were happening everywhere, all at once. And through it all, Nagash remained. Not as a tyrant, not as a conqueror, not even as a god in the way mortals understood the term. He remained as function, as certainty, as the only force that had anticipated this outcome and prepared for it. The gods had tried to save the world. Chaos had tried to devour it. Mortals had tried to endure it. Only Nagash had planned for what came after. The world did not die screaming. It lived on, broken, haunted, and exhausted, because death itself no longer knew how to finish the job, and that mercy would not last. What comes after the end? Chapter 10. The world did not notice the moment it truly ended. There was no single catastrophe left to mark it, no final war, no ultimate battle, no last stand that mattered more than any other. The end times concluded, not with destruction, but with transition. By the time the last alignments fell into place, the living were already exhausted. Civilizations had been bled dry by wars that solved nothing. Gods had spent their remaining strength on miracles that delayed the inevitable. Chaos had burned itself brighter and faster, consuming what little resistance remained. There was nothing left to escalate, only to conclude. Death, fractured and unstable, began to settle, not back into its old form, into something new. The contradictory afterlives collapsed into one another. Fragmented souls ceased screaming and grew quiet, not at peace, but at rest. The dead no longer surged unpredictably. They waited. This was Nagash's final victory. Not dominance, resolution. He did not reform as a single being. He did not need to. Nagash existed now as principle rather than presence, embedded in every grave, every ending, every breath that failed to draw another. He was not watching the world die. He was allowing it to finish. The gods understood at last. Their era had been one of stewardship, not ownership, and they had mistaken one for the other. They had guided, argued, and competed over a reality they did not truly control. Nagash had seen what they refused to, that the universe trends towards silence. And silence requires structure. Some gods faded quietly, their worship exhausted, their purpose redundant. Others raged until the very end, refusing to accept a cosmos that no longer needed them. None escaped, not through death, through irrelevance. Chaos made its final attempt, not to win, to deny. The dark gods hurled everything they had left into the dying world, seeking to drown it in excess, madness, and ruin before it could settle into Nagash's cold equilibrium. The result was devastation without direction, noise without meaning. And then chaos, too, began to starve, with fewer mortals left to corrupt, fewer souls left to claim. The great game lost momentum. Its infinite cycles slowed, not because chaos was defeated, but because there was nothing left worth fighting over. Entropy had won. Mortals experienced the end differently. Some died in terror, some in defiance, some never realized what was happening at all. Empires fell, but so did villages unnoticed by history. Legends perished alongside nameless lives. The End Times were democratic in that way. Cetra was still marching when the world finally failed him. Not defeated, outpaced. His will could not command a reality that no longer cared about kings. Even Cetra, imperishable, was subject to an ending that did not recognize defiance as virtue. He did not kneel. He simply stopped mattering. Arkan the Black remained until the very last, not as a servant awaiting reward, but as a witness. He saw the truth completed, not in glory, but in correctness. The world had not been saved. It had been processed. And for the first time since time began, death functioned as it always should have. Completely, universally, without exception. The final moments were quiet. No heroes rose. No gods intervened. No new age was proclaimed. The world exhaled one last time and did not breathe again. And in that silence, Nagash endured, not ruling, not judging, not celebrating, simply being, the last constant in a universe that had exhausted every other possibility. This is the truth the End Times leave behind. Nagash was never the villain. He was the conclusion everyone else refused to write. The gods promised salvation. Chaos promised freedom. Mortals promised hope. Nagash promised an ending. And in the End Times, he was the only one who kept that promise.